These prospects were winger Ian Schultz and centerman Lars Eller, who at the time was say, he might be ready for next season. Now, Pierre Gauthier was the general manager, the one we lovably call the Ghost. And he called it, I actually managed to pop up an old article from the Canadian press, and I'm quoting here that he called it a big picture decision, in which the team scouts and managers opted for the long-term potential of the 22-year-old Price, the 5th overall draft pick of 2005, over the more immediate success from the 25-year-old Halak. Now, remember, this was the spring of Halak, all right, where he literally robbed everyone left, right, and center. And I'm glad everything. And I am glad to say that I was there that game where he did, 5,000 saves or something against Ovechkin and the Capitals. And it was one of the greatest experiences of my life, being able to see 3 playoff games. It was, shout out to my dad for that one, because he's the one who brought me. Now I'm reading again directly from the article, and they say it's a shame, a nightmare, and April Fools in June were among the comments posted on one website. And this is a funny one, considering that as we're recording, there was actually a notification on our phones that went off saying that we're actually going to go we're up for elections this September. In the House of Commons in Ottawa, Liberal MP Justin Trudeau said, "What? Halak for 2 hockey sticks and a bag of magic beans?" Again, shows how much this guy knows. But guys, I mean, it's kind of funny. I remember how much controversy there was behind that trade. So here's the what if. What if the Canadiens had kept Yaroslav Halak and traded Carey Price instead? Now, granted, we probably would have gotten a huge haul in return, trade-wise, but history would probably be completely different. And I'm seeing Scott jumping on the edge of his seat right now, being like, I want to go first. You want to go first, Scott?
Sure. And I also wanted to kind of throw caution to the wind a little bit and do like a Wayne's World back in time with the doodly doodly doodly. And I wanted to go back to the 2005 NHL draft to kind of put things into a bit more perspective regarding Price, because the Yaroslav Halak trade isn't the only part of this saga. It also goes back to when the Canadiens drafted Price in the 2005 NHL draft. They picked him 5th overall, and as Sam will mention later, there was a bit of some backlash that came from that in the immediacy, because at the time the Canadiens had Cristobal Huet, the Canadiens had Jose Fedor, and while they ultimately wound up trading Jose Fedor for David Abishir, which didn't really work out that well, they had a starting goalie at the time. So the question was, why did the Canadiens draft Price when there was other options available?
Which also begged the question, for interrupting. A lot of pundits back then were like, you don't draft a goaltender that high unless he's the next Martin Brodeur or whatever, because I don't think since Fleury has a goaltender been drafted that high, right?
We all remember Rick DiPietro, right?
Yeah, that's true.
The luckiest man on earth, along with Bobby Bonilla.
Yeah. The thing is, the Canadiens also could have gotten out of this okay if there wasn't a certain name that came after Price, because for the most part, the 2005 draft was a really bad draft. There weren't really a lot of guys who came out of that draft who were true game-breaking stars. Oh, no. Except for a certain man named Anze Kopitar, who went 11th
and
overall.
Also this is the year Crosby went to Pittsburgh as well.
Well, but after Price, I'm talking about players in terms of players selected after Carey Price.
Well, listen, I'll jump in right away, because like the guy right after was Gilbert Brûlé, who was supposed to be a huge player back then, but like I'm seeing Jack Skilly, Devin Setoguchi, Ryan Lee, Luc Bourdon, and then Anze
Bourdon's an exception.
Bourdon's an exception, yeah, exactly. Anze Kopitar, Mark Stahl.
Don't forget Marek Zagrapan.
Marek Zagrapan, Sasha Pakaluk. So again, Ryan. So like there was nothing except even Martin Hansel, who was a good player, but like he was a third liner at the most. Tuukka Rask, TJ Oshie, and that's it. There was nothing in this draft, man.
Well, and also the thing to talk about Tuukka Rask is that the team who drafted him gave him away for Andrew Raycroft, so you can kind of figure out which trade is the worst one when you're kind of looking back in retrospect. But the thing about the Canadiens that is just important to mention in regard to their decision to draft Price, and again, I'm probably going to get flamed for saying all of this because Price is kind of held in almost, how would you say, almost like a biblical sense here in Montreal, where he's kind of held as this kind of figure who's been very helpful to the team in terms of their fans, at least.
Oh yeah,
The
he's our
Canes
Jesus for sure.
Yeah, well, the Canadiens have had a lot of really talented goalies who have come through in during Price's time, like Halak and Hue and Fedor. So I think the question I always wonder to myself, and I've wondered this in thinking back in the 2005 draft, is that if the Habs hadn't drafted Price, who would be our starting goalie now? Would Halak still be here? Would Hue still be here? That's the thing I always kind of wonder in the immediacy of it, is because Price went through a really rough stretch when Halak came here in Montreal and when he really went on that magical playoff run. And for a while, it looked like that Price was never really going to get out of those growing pains. While he did eventually, he unfortunately fell right back into them, and now it's kind of been an on and off battle. But
Okay,
I definitely think that Halak was kind of the one that got away for the Canadiens, especially when you consider the fact of who they got in return and how Eller never really worked out.
Yeah, Lars Eller unfortunately absolutely hated playing here. So I mean that was unfortunate. Despite him, like today, he's a very respected, and
a very respectable player.
Very respectable player, exactly in the same mold as Philippe Danault. He's like same kind of player, so to speak. But now we can go back and I love going back in old drafts, being like, oh man, we could have drafted him, could have drafted there, because again, we're talking about 2005, and I'm scrolling down the list, and Christopher Letang was drafted in the third round. So, I mean, like the Pittsburgh got Crosby and Letang in the same damn draft.
Oh, and don't forget, I believe it was, Patrick Hornqvist was the last pick in this draft.
Patrick Hornquist, was the last one.
Was the very last pick in this draft. Right after Montreal drafted. So
Montreal drafted Sergei Kostitsyn in that round as well.
Yes.
So I mean that was pretty cool. But the big question was when we started this segment is, okay, now let's forget about the draft. Everything happened as it should have happened, but now we're in 2010. It's the summer. Halak just stole the show all spring. Brought the Canadiens to the conference finals along, ironically enough, with Jacques Martin as our coach playing a very defensive system, and which, it sounds kind of familiar to what we just went through this past off season. And now there was this big question. Oh, okay. Now do we need to trade Price? Do we trade Halak? Josh, you're general manager of the Canadiens. You're sitting there. You got those two boys in front of you. What do you do?
It's so hard because that playoff run is so good that Halak goes on. It's the numbers officially that year were 923 save percentage, 2.55 goals against. But if you're looking at the guys that he's going up against like prime Ovechkin, prime Crosby and Malkin, and he's shutting the door on these guys. And it was like the year that I really got into hockey, watching it with my dad late at night in Ontario, surrounded by Leafs fans, and we're watching the Habs destroy Washington and Pittsburgh, just eking by. So it's really hard to.
A very bad team up front, not a very great team aside from Holland.
Yeah. So it's really hard to. It's easy to go back and say, oh, well, obviously you'd pick the Hart Trophy winner. But back then it was really tough. And the biggest what if, like, we never would have guessed that Price would have blossomed as well as he did and gotten that big $10 million contract.
Yeah, no kidding.
Yeah, so that's a lot of money that you get to play around with if you don't have Price on the roster, but then there's a lot less great goaltending that you have to deal with. So,
Josh, I mean, if you look at the roster itself in 10-11, okay, that was the Brian Giunta was our captain. Looking at veterans, there was Hal Gill, Mathieu Darche was still part of that team. Our backup goalie ended up being Alex Auld. Mike Camilleri was still around before he got the boot. David Desharnais, Max Pacioretty.
Got the boot mid-game.
Yeah, exactly. It was whatever. It was terrible. Josh Georges was still among us and everything. Max Lapierre, Andrei Markov. And I'm looking at some of the youngsters. We had a 23-year-old Carey Price, a 23-year-old Tom Pyatt. Remember him? PK
somewhere.
Yeah, PK was there. He was 21 years old. We had just brought in James Wisniewski as well. Georges was 26. So like we still had like a relatively young team with a couple of veterans. I mean, I'm looking at this. It's like, okay, aside from the goalies, it's very similar to what we had today, except we didn't have a lot of firepower up front. Now, this begs the question. I mean, you just had a red hot Yaroslav Halak, And you had Carey Price, who hasn't proved anything yet in the NHL, because even that year he didn't have that great a year. But you can't really blame anyone for that matter, because we didn't have that great a team to begin with. But despite everything, like they played him for 72 games, still got 38 wins, 235 GAA, 923 save percentage. I mean, it was still very, very respectable numbers, even, actually more than respectable numbers for that matter. But you trade Carey Price, let's say, because you know that despite Halak's sudden high value, you could trade him, right? I mean, I know it sounds like I'm rambling, but I'm trying to get to this point where his value was like ultra high at the time. And, it's like he was just one of the highest touted prospects in the league, regardless. I mean, I would have given, I honestly, at the time, without knowing what would happen, I would have traded him.
Yeah, I'm in agreement with you on that one, honestly. Patrick, as weird as that might sound, I think that Price was in a stage where a lot of NHL prospects are who get traded at some point. Like we can think to Elias Anderson in today's world, where he's been bounced around teams like crazy, and you can even think to the current Jack Eichel situation, where the Buffalo Sabres
Buffalo's moving. Scott has announcing first.
Where the Buffalo Sabres are currently holding Jack Eichel for ransom, essentially, and they're basically pinning him against the wall and saying that you want to act like this, well, we're just not going to trade you. And I feel like that at the time, maybe Price was not in quite as toxic a situation, but the important thing that a lot of people have to remember about this Canadiens team that went on this run of Halak is that people think that this Canadiens team has struggles on offense. Woo boy, you haven't seen Dominic Moore scoring the game-winning goal for your team off a pass from Hal Gill. And then you can come speak to me about lack of firepower. I think that Canadiens team is definitely defined by those glue guys. So
yeah, Hal Gill would call him the squid, because he would just like lie down in front of the net and spread his legs and arms.
They were what is known as up and over defensemen, guys. Their only move was up and off the glass. That was all they could do.
Exactly. So, I mean, this is the great thing about the what ifs, right? I mean, what if what if Pittsburgh hadn't won the draft lottery that year? What if Montreal would have won it, and we would have drafted Sidney Crosby instead of Carey Price? Yes, see, everyone's kind of digesting that right now. Everyone's like, yeah, I mean, man, come on, that'll be amazing. But
yeah.
One of my favorite what ifs. One of my favorite what ifs before you mentioned Tom Pyatt. The year before Montreal goes on this great run, Montreal acquires Tom Pyatt, Scott Gomez, and Michael Busto, and they give up Ryan McDonough along with other guys, Christopher Higgins, but McDonough was the big one, and that one really stings when you learn about it.
Guys, that should be another segment for another time about the Michael worst Busto trades. Was one heck of a player.
One heck of a player. It reminds me also of the time where we Ryan McDonough, you're forgetting the key player in that trade, the Alaskan sensation Scott Gomez.
Had a great first season with us.
At 8 million pesos a year, my friend. He was incredible. He had that one goal, I think, in 2 years.
I remember a website. They were counting down the days between his goals.
Yes.
Oh, man. It was absolutely ridiculous. But it's, the same thing can almost be said about the Sergachev trade, right? I mean, was it trade Drouin for Sergachev, or Drouin and a pick, for that matter, for Sergachev. And, look, it got shoved in her face in the finals this year.
I don't think Sergachev can really hear what we're saying because the 2 Stanley Cup rings that have been plugged in his ears. So
I was actually just going to mention Patrick Roy for that matter. I mean, and for those who don't know about this, Patrick Roy, back when he was in Colorado, they were facing, I believe, the Blackhawks.
Yep, Jeremy Roenick.
And Jeremy Roenick was, I don't know, Roenick being Roenick, JR was he was really well known for, his controversial interviews and saying it how it was. And he was, messing with Roy in the media. And then Roy was like, I have no idea what he said. My 2 ears are plugged with my Stanley Cup rings. So, but that was another trade. Right. I mean, again, another what if.
These what ifs forever. I mean, I saw an article, somebody talking about how the Habs could have drafted Brayden Point, and I say, yeah, so could all the other 79 teams who passed on Brayden Point.
Exactly.
Speculation at that point.
I would love to be able to maybe take some time at some point talking about the Patrick Roy trade, because not especially now that we know that regardless of what would have happened, he was going to Colorado no matter what. Because before Serge Savard got fired as general manager, he had a deal in place with Colorado where he was trading Patrick Roy for Stéphane Fiset, Owen Nolan, and apparently like a couple of draft picks or something. So, and at the time, Owen Nolan was a huge star. He was like the prototypical power forward.
And we swapped that for Andre